So welcome everyone. I am really excited to announce another lecturer, Joycelyn Longdon, for today's sort of lecture event of the A-Action lecture series. A-Action is a student-led program at the AA, for those of you who don't know, which tries to sort of reapply critical thinking about climate change to architectural pedagogy through different working groups and lecture and seminar series. Today's talk about colonial heritage and environmental injustice by Joycelyn Longdon is about the crisis that we are facing today, which links social and ecological injustice to colonial heritage. For centuries now, it's been a common practice for Western countries to dictate to so-called developing countries how to farm their land, construct their buildings, rule their people, and manage their economies. Neoliberal political systems inherited from colonialization have an intrinsic role in the climate crisis. But colonization is not a thing of the past. It lingers on, and the power dynamic between countries and their people tend to silence voices and destroy the planet in the process. In order to be fair and just, the environmental movement needs to acknowledge colonialism, both past and present. It also needs to acknowledge and embrace diversity. Our speaker today, Joycelyn Longdon, is a current Master of Research student and PhD candidate at on the AI for Environmental Risk program at the University of Cambridge, looking at integrating indigenous knowledge into tech-driven solutions for climate change. She's also the founder of Climate in Color, a platform at the intersection of climate science and social injustice, as well as creative director at Black on Black Creative. So now I'd like to welcome Joycelyn to give her lecture, followed by a group discussion and panel questions, whatever everyone feels like.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, I'll just get started. So yeah, thank you for that great introduction. Today I'm going to be speaking, as was just mentioned, about colonialism, environmental injustice, and how these specifically map onto and influence my work, both in academia and in the social media spaces. And my hope is that with sort of a greater knowledge of how colonialism influences our current climate emergency, that more individuals, especially within academia and artistic practice spheres, can begin to question and interrogate, and in doing so dismantle its legacy in their own practices. So my talk will be split into roughly 3 even sections, and I'll begin by diving into a brief description of the colonial history of climate, and then move on to describe firstly how this influences my research, perspective and goals, and then lastly how it influences the way I communicate and educate on the topic of climate. And I'll end by looking to futures and give some prompts for you to leave with and reflect on in terms of actioning some of the information from this presentation. So starting off with the colonial history of climate, the following material is inspired by the 2018 Climate Colonialism paper by Martin Mahoney and Georgina Enfield. And the content sits as an hour-long course, pre-recorded course on the Climate in Colour website. And it is co-hosted with Nathan Lawson, who is the Oxford Climate Society president, and is built in with sort of online prompts and reflections and accompanied by a resource pack with a lot of further reading and references on colonialism, environmental injustice, environmental racism, and neocolonialism. Today, however, I'll just sort of give a quick overview of the main key points in that course to build up an image of the direct links between colonialism and our current climate emergency, and the reality of the disproportionate effect it has had, is having, and will have on the BIPOC community. So starting with some definitions, colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country and occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And conversely, imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force or other means, and was sort of first associated with the Roman Empire. And when thinking about these two phenomena, we can think of colonialism as sort of the practice and imperialism as the theory behind that practice. And when we're having these conversations, it's also really important to talk about globalization, especially when we're talking about colonialism and looking at neo-colonial behaviors. So with the facilitation of technology, globalization has intensified cross-cultural interactions, but has also introduced sort of global hierarchy, an economic system that sees some countries benefiting heavily and growing richer by the day, while others, usually in the global south, have largely been left behind or are exploited for labor. And the aggressive expansion of some countries, in contrast to others, makes some liken globalization to a modern day imperialism. So what has any of this got to do with climate change? Well, colonialism was based on climate and climate-motivated colonialism. And this was because ideas of climatic differences of global regions directly informed imperial behaviors. So the concept of climatic determinism explains this well. Climatic determinism is the study of how the physical environment predisposes societies and states towards particular development trajectories and has been ingrained in the intellectual history of the Western world. In practice, this influenced colonists' thoughts about how the health, race, productivity, politics, and conflict of humans around the world. But it was also foundational to European self-identification of inherent superiority, creating sort of defined differences, shortcomings, and failures between Europeans and tropical communities. And lastly, it gave Europeans at the time a scientific basis on which to justify their right to empire. BIPOC people around the world, and BIPOC is just an abbreviation for Black, Indigenous, and people of colour, were seen as lazy in the colonists' eyes. This was for many reasons, but the two main reasons are based either in sort of environmental factors, again with this climatic determinism, or in the cultures of those communities. So firstly, the tropical areas, which most of the colonized lands were located in at the time, with hot and humid climates and rich soils, were highly biologically productive, which led the Europeans to believe that they sort of only had to expel quite little human work in terms of growing subsistence crops. And they associated their superiority with the necessary level of labour needed. And secondly, many indigenous cultures followed gifting economies and took only what they needed from the land, sometimes leaving more than half of the crops they sowed to give back to nature. And in the eyes of the capitalist colonists, this was sort of an absurd show. Europeans believed that they were more hardworking and sophisticated, having to create technology to assist them in agricultural endeavours. And this thinking of superiority applied not just to people, but to nature as well. And by the late 1870s, the whole concept of nature's limits was being replaced by the idea that man's actions could and or were overcoming nature's deficiencies. And so here the idea of climatic improvement that became central to the colonial enterprise was born. And it sort of stated that Western man was the most powerful force on the planet. And Europeans felt that it was their right and duty to not only civilize the sort of lazy and barbaric indigenous people in their minds, but also the wild and untamable nature. The inception of meteorology and climatology, which are the studies of climate and weather, in colonies around the world was an attempt, consciously or unconsciously, to reinforce the superiority of Europeans, with these sciences being seen as the hallmark of civilization. Even though the European Empire had been in full operation for hundreds of years, full vigour for the project didn't re-emerge until the 19th century, when the geographer and mathematician Alexander von Humboldt brought back tales and observations from his Andes exploration. From his Andes exploration. And he described the ways that isothermal lines could provide the ability to compare different climates, to identify regions where the colonial project could correct sort of trade imbalances that they had, in their eyes, so unfairly encountered in products like olives, wine, and rice. And despite von Humboldt's sort of outward disgust of slavery and his descriptions of a rich and intelligent indigenous community in South America, he went on to advise the Royal Society to make better use of Britain's imperial reach to record worldwide weather patterns. This call to action resulted in observation labs appearing all over the British colonies, and in a sense, they sort of answered the calls of colonialism and modern science, which demand to know and categorize, and in doing so, control environments. This new science went on to push out many of the important links to indigenous peoples that enabled colonists to even settle and understand their new lands in the first place. For example, in New Zealand, formal meteorological observations began appearing in newspapers in around 1850. Displacing earlier engagements that colonists had with Maori weather knowledge and methods of foretelling. Paraphrasing from the Mahoney paper, indigenous communities have a wealth of experience with climate variability, and their knowledge is embedded into their ecosystem, largely passed through oral tradition. These knowledge systems gave and still give us important information and insight into climate society interactions, and directly tie into our modern day debates and conversations about climate adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience. So on the screen now are 3 examples of traditional land practices, and there are thousands of them, but these are a couple of examples that I used in the course. The first on the left is the Zai traditional farming method, which was revived in Burkina Faso in the 1980s. And it has helped to stop desertification, plant in vast forests, and reversing the effects of drought in quite dry areas like Burkina Faso. In the top right, I quickly mention the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and their work in protecting, now I think that's left 3% of the highlands, which once used to be sprawling forest, and they apply their religious tradition of building circular walls around churches to building circular walls around forests to protect them from encroachment. And then we have cultural burning, which is a traditional Aboriginal practice, but also seen in Native American culture as well. And this is small-scale burning at the right times of year and in the right places to minimize the risk of large wildfires. So now, as it was then, our climate decisions in the West are made sort of without consideration for the lives of those in Global South or those who are marginalized, but with the imperative of our own continued success and stability. The calls for climate solutions and sustainability that are rooted in colonial thinking and behaviours are wide and varied, and I don't think we should be satisfied with the misconception that we are living in post-colonial times. 80% of the world's biodiversity, essentially the Earth's lungs, are cared for and provided and protected by indigenous people around the world, who make up only 5% of our population. And according to Oxfam, just 10% of the world's population is responsible for 50% of global emissions, whereas the poorest 50% are only responsible for 10% of global emissions. And so the glaring injustices brought upon the Global South and marginalized communities in the Global North in the name of scientific progression and environmental advancement of the West are all sort of described quite well by the concept of sacrifice zones. And these are geographic areas that have been permanently impaired by environmental damage or economic divestment. And these zones bear the burden of the global industrial economies as a means to sort of apparently benefit society as a whole. But there are issues with our sort of Western concepts of development and progress And these are the very concepts, abstract as they are, that are killing Black, brown and indigenous people around the world. And the obvious point here with sacrifice zones is that the nations and communities that are nominated for sacrifice are nominated by people and systems halfway across the world and outside of their lived experience. So yeah, I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about my own practice, firstly within academia, and then I'll go on to talk about communicating the climate crisis. So regardless of the ways that I, as a Black diasporic woman of colour, am oppressed, there is no doubt about the privileges that I am awarded as an academic studying in the global north. And these privileges are based directly on the history that I have just recounted, especially in the environmental space, that, as with most spaces, has a history of oppressing, dispossessing, and harming people who look like me. Through climatology and meteorology, the colonial project justified the displacement of indigenous knowledge through the paternalistic view of improvement, advancement, and development. And so it is essential to first acknowledge and understand this past, but that's not enough either. A deep interrogation of my practice is necessary in order to not just avoid, but dismantle systems of oppression continuing in research. I want to share with you some words from a 2015 paper on decolonizing food justice by Catherine Bradley and Frank Herrera. And although they speak specifically to food justice and sovereignty, it is evident that the sentiment is accurate and impactful in most academic and artistic practice environments. She goes on to say, theorizing decolonization and decolonizing ourselves as we collaborate in activism and research are very different types of challenges. While theory is often applied to case studies, it is far less common to read in a peer-reviewed work how scholars make meaning of theory in personal ways. And the tendency of academics to call out racism and oppression without also reflecting on the ways that scholarship and scholars reinscribe oppression merely buttresses the academy's power. Academic endeavours can lead to appropriating stories, removing them from context in such a way that they do not serve the communities in which they originate. The practice of power needs to be visible. Honesty about what shapes the research, especially personal connections and networks, emotional and interpersonal challenges, and skill sets constitutes meaningful resistance to academic and educational privilege, racism, and moralism. And I paraphrase here that we must turn a critical gaze upon our collaboration in an effort to be the change that we want to see. So turning to my own research, which will formally begin in the autumn after my master's year as its sort of integrated PhD. There are many questions I need to posit and examine and subsequently create a framework from with which to build my research on. I plan on looking at how to use artificial intelligence and remote sensing, sort of Earth observation satellite data, to firstly understand how forests are changing over time, whether that's through deforestation, and then hence calculating the amount of carbon that is being sequestered or lost. And then mapping this to current or past indigenous lands in order to provide concrete evidence and data to be used in the land back movement, reconnecting indigenous communities to their sovereign lands. The pushing out and outlawing of traditional indigenous land stewardship practices through the colonial period saw these communities dispossessed of their lands, of which many include forests. The world increasingly acknowledges the importance of our dwindling forests and the biodiversity they carry as a key part of the climate emergency solution. But large-scale forest protection or reforestation projects, such as the UN RED programme, have walked in the footsteps of colonial forefathers and inflicted violence against indigenous forest peoples. One example is that of the Embu forest peoples of Kenya, where the community was forced from their homes and dispossessed of their ancestral lands in order to create forest plantations for carbon offsetting for European corporations. This is a trend that is growing and occurring across the global south, with indigenous peoples being forced out of their ancestral homes and lands in order for the global north to continue hiding behind a charade of sustainability and sort of sustainable superiority in order to continue economic growth built on colonial and capitalist endeavours. As we become ever more reliant and invested in the omniscient power of technology and blinded by scalability, our approaches to forest conservation are also becoming increasingly capitalistic and neocolonial. Jennifer Gabrice speaks on this phenomenon in her paper Smart Forests: From the Internet of Trees to Planetary Governance. She describes how environments are increasingly becoming technologized sites of data production. And she also describes the way in which, for example, startup drone companies are developing digital techniques for mass planting forests from the sky, working towards the objective of planting 1 billion trees per year. These technologies are meant to offer sort of rapid and industrial scale reforestation techniques to compensate for industrial scale deforestation. She notes that digital technologies are often presented as necessary, if unproblematic, tools for meeting ambitious environmental objectives, including climate change, but makes the point that without understanding how these technologies both enable and constrain particular modes of governance and engagement with forests, the development of smart environments such as the smart forest does run the risk of producing social political inequities and undemocratic governance, including land grabs, as previously explained. And so this is where my research hopes to sort of disrupt the status quo, but without sort of thorough reflection on how I conduct this research or a creation of a framework with which to move forward, I could end up subconsciously perpetuating the systems that I wish to dismantle. I have to really ask myself some quite important questions, like how do I make sure that engagement with an indigenous community is not extractive? How do I create space outside of what I already know in order to mold my research methods in ways that honour the culture of the community I work with? What extended legacy plan is built into my study in order to avoid helicopter science, where researchers drop in, use a community for data, and then leave them? How do I navigate critiquing and dismantling the problematic aspects of Western science whilst simultaneously employing techniques from the same space? And how do I create space to centre the voices where mine may not be appropriate? I may be oppressed in one way as a Black woman, but in other ways I hold many privileges being a postgraduate student in the global north at a very wealthy institution. There are so many more questions I could and will have to ask myself, but I share these examples to demonstrate the depth of reflection that we must carry in our practice to ensure solidarity with marginalised communities goes further than just the written word. Going further than just the written word relates to moving from theory to practice, but also to expanding the media used for communication, creating more accessible avenues for society to engage with important topics such as climate change. The elitism within academia that focuses on citations and publications and holds the written word as the only valid source, especially in science, mirrors the colonial perspectives of Western science being a hallmark of civilization. Yet, it's important to ask questions such as who has access to this writing, who pens this writing, and who has the power to decide its validity. Formal education in climate or environmental studies, technology, architectural design, for the most part, don't really mention environmental racism, bias, colonialism, or capitalism as either causes or repercussions linked to the climate crisis. My work through Climate in Colour seeks to dismantle these issues by communicating climate science and climate justice in accessible formats, from video to audio to graphic design, as well as writing. My academic rigour is not compromised by the form of my resources, with every post, course and video being deeply researched and sourced, but instead working through creative media allows information usually locked behind academic paywalls and institution doors to be accessed by the general public, who do have a right to know and understand the phenomena that impact our society's futures. Akin to my research, the goal here is to centre the voices of the vulnerable, the marginalised and oppressed communities at the forefront of the climate emergency, and mobilise action amongst allies through knowledge sharing. My work provides value and creates impact in two main ways. The first is challenging the academic status quo. So when I first started Climate in Colour, less than a year ago, I would constantly receive messages from students and even researchers and professors in the environmental space who were shocked that they sort of hadn't come across the topics that I was talking about. But I now receive messages from students asking me to use my resources in their research projects. And I've now worked with both Oxford University and Ravensbourne University in order to provide in-person workshops and discussions to tackle colonialism and bias as part of their core course syllabus. The messages I receive now show just how much can change in a year and how much can be changed by stepping outside of the confinement of the academic box. The second way that impact and value is provided is through widening participation. We blame a lot of issues now, especially amidst COVID, on our leaders' inability to follow the science or their scapegoating of the science. Yet how are non-scientists supposed to engage with the science when it is communicated in such obscure, specific and insular formats? Now, that isn't to let these politicians off the hook, but it's just to say that there's a huge ridge between the academic, scientific world and the public realm. Accessibility isn't just about non-scientists either. Within the scientific space, there are many who are excluded or forced to find difficulty with material due to having dyslexia, autism, or being visually impaired. This last point comes up as being one of the main hindrances to many people getting involved or engaging with climate science or environmental work. At Climate in Colour, one of our main initiatives is the Climate in Colour Reads group, which is a space to sort of explore climate literature in an accessible and immersive way for those who want a deeper dive into the climate space, its issues and its history, but are sort of daunted by the prospect. Each month, we read an academic text on environmentalism, climate or technology, and I provide audio versions of the text, a full written summary for those who don't want to or cannot read the original PDF text, included with definitions and the original paper that is highlighted. We also mark each paper for its accessibility to understand what makes an academic paper accessible and what makes it exclusive. This reading group is filled with majority non-scientists, and the conversations that we have in our monthly meetings are really, really expansive and interesting, with most people having a lot to say, challenging their thought patterns and connecting with others on their new learnings. And so it's incredible to see how the space can be opened up in this way to people who would never really engage with academic literature or work, and achieving that by meeting them where they are, rather than sort of gatekeeping that knowledge. So I believe that if we're to start imagining futures that are equitable, safe, anti-racist, and that dismantle oppressive systems like colonialism, we need to involve everyone in the conversation. And we need to move away from paternalistic modes of engagement with vulnerable communities and push for democratic engagement, self-determination, and honourable collaboration. I use the plural here for futures intentionally because I don't believe in a homogenous utopia, but rather futures filled with the imaginings of billions of people who have different lived experiences and yearnings for different futures. Futures are not mutually exclusive. Today we live in a world where gay couples can get married and where the Vice President of America is a Black woman. These futures that were wished for decades ago by distinct groups now coexist, and although commonly accepted as the bare minimum and harbour many complexities in themselves, they are realised futures nonetheless. Dr. Ronita Bardan, who's a university lecturer of sustainability and built environment in the Department of Architecture at Cambridge, tells us that how a city performs depends on how it is designed, how it's planned, and adds that often the data that lies where impacts are felt most are often either ignored or remain unidentified. And I find it appropriate to extend this thinking, not just for cities, but for our global society. The way that we communicate and the impact we have on the environment are all governed by design. Design is foundational to our lives and our legacies, which makes it foundational to our futures. I currently sit on the advisory panel for the 2021 Wastage exhibition, curated by the Design Museum in London. And the exhibition aims to tell the story of the environmental crisis created by our take, make, and waste economy, and explore how design can transform our waste into new valuable resources, and how design can help usher in a new age where there is no such thing as waste. But in our conversation, we also grapple with the positioning of design as the solution to our dirty habit, when it is also important to recognise design as one of the key culprits in our polluting consumer-driven behaviours. As part of her work with the Design Museum, through the Biologics Designing with Nature display, Nat Chaser, founder of award-winning design agency Faber Futures, has created what she calls a roadmap for preferable futures. And here are just two excerpts from it, from the earliest parts of the timeline. And this roadmap for preferable futures holds critical ideas on human and non-human flourishing that have for too long existed in the margins. The roadmap is positioned as a response to the growing support for intersectional equity-based environmentalism, which she notes is important for design and biotechnology futures, and here I paraphrase, because design has the opportunity to reset its value drivers so that its tools can be used to design for repair rations and taking care. The roadmap illustrates the evolution of design since the first industrial revolution to the fourth industrial revolution, which is characterized by the blurring between the lines and boundaries between the physical, digital, and biological worlds. It also highlights the relationships between forms of production, economies, technology, and culture that have created harmful feedback loops, resulting in biodiversity loss, climate change, and systemic racial and social inequalities. Natsai posits here an important question, which is that if we are to redesign how we make and consume based on humanity working with nature rather than against it, then what alternative design frameworks emerge and what other systems are they in dialogue with? In order to achieve these equitable futures, I believe that academics and artistic practitioners alike need to adopt the practices of deep reflection and deep listening. So deep reflection as a tool for critical self-analysis, critical analysis of how we may be working against the goals and values we say we believe in, understanding the historic and current links to oppression and violence that our practice may currently have, and conceptualizing tangible ways in which we can rectify and dismantle them. And deep listening, which was coined in 1989 by the late Pauline Oliveros to describe a practice of radical attentiveness. And so I believe that using this for a tool for radical vulnerability and honesty, stepping back and acknowledging that we don't have an understanding of all realities and experiences, and giving space to those whose voices and narratives are very often silenced and or ignored. So with these thoughts now hopefully bubbling in your head, I'd like to close with a question. You can answer it in the discussion section of this talk, or save it as a journal prompt, or even use it as a conversation starter with your colleagues and peers. But the question is, what are 3 things you can do going forward to challenge colonial structures in your environmental work or your artistic practice, your activism, or your personal life? So yeah, thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.